all, welcome to this special edition of the Mobile Home Park Desktop, where I bring you news, analysis, and insights about the world of mobile home park investing from my desktop. In this episode, we'll be focusing on COVID-19. I just recently came across an article in the Wall Street Journal that reported about a secret group of scientists and billionaires who have been working in a Manhattan Project type style to create recommendations and solutions for this pandemic. As investors, operators, private equity guys, I think it's essential for us to understand this virus so that we know what to expect going forward. How long things will be shut down, whether or not there's going to be recurring shutdowns, in general, what's going to be happening, because then that's going to help us predict future cash flows that much better. So without further ado, let's dive right in. All right, so this is the article I'm talking about. It was in the Wall Street Journal, April 27, 2020, so it's still pretty new. And look at the headline here: the secret group of scientists and billionaires pushing Trump on a COVID-19 plan. Sounds very mysterious. This is a very smart group of people. And they gathered together and they've been working on their own with some venture capitalists and other billionaires. And they've been putting together this plan to sort of like a plan of attack for how we should be dealing with COVID-19. You can definitely read the article. It's interesting. It kind of almost unfolds like a spy novel, talking about all these back channels and people having these discussions until they come to until they kind of come together here and they start formulating this plan. And the end result is this 17-page report that these scientists have put together. And in this report, it talks about how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in 4 different stages. And the four stages are, number one, like what to do right now. What can we do right now? What's going to be most effective right at this moment? Number 2, what's sort of the midterm solution? What could we be doing? What could we be looking at in terms of the next 3 to 6 months? And then number 3, how do we come up with a long-term solution, which is a vaccine? And how can we streamline that process? Because typically a vaccine takes 6 to 8 years to develop. And then finally, they have recommendations about what we should be doing right now to start to reopen the economy, start to reopen businesses. They give a bunch of recommendations on that. So let's start. I'm going to go over real quickly a very, very broad, not detailed explanation of what's going on here. There's this virus that comes into our body. And what happens is it starts to replicate within our body, and that's what causes it to spread. And the way it spreads is through RNA, and there's 3 types of RNA. I don't want to get into all of it, but basically, if you can prevent this RNA from replicating, then you can effectively stop the spread. And the interesting thing about this virus is the enzyme that's needed for the RNA to replicate, which is called RNA replicase. I don't know if that's a generic term or if that's a specific term for COVID-19, but that RNA replicase, this enzyme, is only found in animals. And so that's where this whole issue about whether, how COVID-19 and all these coronaviruses have come from animals, because it's not normally something that humans have in their body. So sort of the first wave of attack, the first thing that we should be doing, according to these scientists, is we should be taking this drug, and maybe you've heard of it, but it's called remdesivir, and it's produced by Gilead, which is a huge pharmaceutical company. And what remdesivir has shown, especially in cases like Ebola, is that it can go in and it can inhibit this RNA replicase. And so if this RNA replicase is inhibited, then this virus basically cannot duplicate, cannot spread, cannot get worse. And so what they're recommending, one of the recommendations is we need to really ramp up our production of remdesivir, because apparently right now there's not a whole lot of it, and so it's being used very sparingly. So they recommend, instead of using it sparingly, we need to up the dosage so people are getting stronger doses of this remdesivir, and that people are getting it sooner in their treatment. And because it's in a limited supply right now, they're sort of only using it for severe cases. I actually have a friend who's a doctor, and he works in a hospital that's been very affected by all these COVID-19 cases, and they have a hard time getting hold of this drug. So that's sort of the first recommendation, is ramp up production of remdesivir. get different pharmaceutical companies to all kind of work together and figure out a way to ramp up production, maybe produce it in an inhalant form, and then doctors, once they have more access to this, then they can start to use it on patients sooner and in higher doses, and that should help prevent the spread of the disease within the patients. The second wave, the second area of attack that they're recommending is what's known as the use of monoclonal antibodies. Oh, that's that's a hard word. But what this means is it's basically taking antibodies from healthy patients, people who have recovered from COVID-19, and then using those healthy antibodies and creating more antibodies from them. It's basically cloning antibodies. That's where the word clonal comes in here. And so what they're saying here is that what we need to do with this is we need to ramp up the speed and process of clinical trials. We need to start doing clinical trials now. And typically there's a long process involved with presenting all your what you want to study to the FDA, and then them after you finish with the clinical trials, them taking some time to review it and all this other stuff. And this is like a 9 to 12 month process. And what they're saying is that let's get the FDA working with the American companies alongside the clinical trials, reviewing the results as they come in, so that at the end, after the clinical trials are completed, they can immediately move to approving this drug for use in the American population. The other important part of this is that we need to massively improve the manufacturing capabilities of American companies to produce these antibody therapies and to produce all of these drugs and vaccines, which we'll talk about next. And so one of the recommendations that they're saying is, hey, let's take some of these other drugs that are being produced domestically and let's offshore them. Let's have those being produced in a different country. And normally the process to do this takes a long time to get FDA approval of these different manufacturing plants elsewhere. But they're saying, hey, let's streamline this process. Let's get this done quicker so that we can start to offshore some of these other drugs that are being manufactured and taking up domestic capabilities. And instead we can focus more of the current manufacturing on COVID-19 specific therapies, these antibodies, and later on the vaccines. This brings us to the third wave of attack, the third recommendation they have, and this has to do with the long-term solution of vaccines. And what they're basically saying is, hey, look, we can't wait. We can't go through a typical vaccine development process, because a typical vaccine development process takes 6 to 8 years. And so what we need to do, again, is we need to have the FDA working alongside the scientists, making sure all these approvals happen. What they're actually saying is that there needs to be some sort of oversight, some sort of commission, processing all the information, making sure all the data can be shared with all the people that need to have the data. All the stuff that's coming in from testing is all in one centralized location from all the clinical trials, so that we have the most up-to-date information and that scientists can make the best decisions. And so they're saying that this commission of sorts would oversee the entire process, and that they would be working alongside the FDA to make sure that it doesn't extend out and there aren't these ton of regulatory hurdles in order to get these vaccines produced. And they're also saying we're going to have to make some strategic investments, some strategic bets on certain vaccines that look the most promising, instead of waiting for the clinical trials to completely end, but start developing them immediately, as long as they start to show some promising results. So there's going to be some money spent, and there's going to be some money lost in that process, because not all these vaccines will turn out to be effective. But in the end, we'll be able to produce the most effective vaccines in the quickest amount of time possible. Finally, they have some recommendations for how we can get the economy going, how we can get society opened up again as soon as possible. And the first thing they mention is daily certification of symptoms. So right now, a lot of places have institutes things like taking temperatures, but the fact is that that's not enough. What they want to see is that on a daily basis, people are checking through a variety of different things, and each of these things are weighted in a different way, so that we can tell how likely it is that we have COVID-19, or how likely it is that we're okay. And by collating all this data, it will also help them to make better predictions with other people. So they'll be basically comparing the data of all these different people who are self-reporting. Now, obviously, it would be very difficult, I think, for the average person to sit down here and go through all of these different self-tests and checks and then weight it and then come up with a score. So what they're recommending is some sort of app, I'm sure, where you just, typing in numbers into one centralized database, and then it's spitting out an overall score for you. If you're under the score, then you're fine. You could go out. You're probably, you don't have it. But if you're above a certain number, then you should definitely go get yourself tested. Which is the second part of this, frequent testing. And they're talking about testing every single week. And it gets into why we need to test every week. I know that sounds like like overkill, but it talks a lot about like asymptomatic versus symptomatic, and how even though you may not exhibit any of the symptoms of COVID-19, how you could still be a spreader. And so massive frequent testing is something that they're also recommending, testing all Americans. Finally, they're talking about PPEs, like personal protective equipment, those masks that they're talking about. Now, they do mention that the N95 masks are probably the most effective, but they also say that people aren't always wearing them correctly. And when you don't wear them correctly, they're not quite as effective. And they're also in short supply. So what they recommend is, instead of these N95 masks, we can use these surgical style masks, which aren't quite as effective as the N95, but because people are using the N95 incorrectly, it all balances out. So they're saying that they recommend the surgical style masks, not the cloth masks, although those are better than nothing, but they're saying that the surgical style mask might be a good compromise between N95 and the cloth mask that people are wearing. And finally, they talk about antibody serological testing. And what this means is that they're just testing you after the fact to see whether or not you've had COVID-19. And it's important because if you've had it and you've already developed antibodies for it, then you shouldn't be in these clinical trials, because you're going to be skewing the results. So it's important not only that we're testing to see whether someone has the disease, the presence of COVID-19, it's also important to test whether someone has the presence of these antibodies that you've developed because you've had it and you've recovered from it. Okay, so those are the 4 recommendations that were made by this group of scientists. And before, I'm going to review those in a second, but what's the big takeaway here? Is it that we all have to become epidemiologists? We have to all become COVID-19 specialists in order to make smart investment decisions? I think it helps to have a general understanding of COVID-19 and kind of the efforts that are being undertaken, so that we're not overly optimistic or overly pessimistic about things that we're seeing in the news. And instead, we're focusing on the signals that we're hearing that show that this plan is being put into place, or that other similar plans are being put into place that could help us feel more confidence that we've turned a corner on this, that it's not just that the sun's out and people are going out, so everything must be okay, because we know that's not the case. So to wrap up what I want to go through, these are some of the signals that I'm going to be looking for. If I see them in the news, or if you see them in the news, please let me know about them. I want to hear about them. We could share news, we could share resources, and we can all kind of become better educated about this together. So number 1 is that remdesivir. Ugh, that's a mouthful. So we're looking to see that drug is being sort of mass produced, that it's being more widely available, that they're able to give patients a higher dosage of remdesivir at earlier stages within their exhibiting COVID-19 or testing positive for COVID-19. The other thing that might be a signal is that there's an inhalant form of remdesivir that's been developed. The other thing that we might be looking for is clinical trials. Are clinical trials underway for those, do you remember that word, monoclonal antibodies? And is the FDA working alongside in these clinical trials to make sure that the approval process is as streamlined as possible? So the thing about clinical trials is they're not always necessarily publicly announced. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a doctor, and I kind of asked him, I said, are we going to know when clinical trials are happening within a hospital? He said, well, they don't always announce that stuff. So that might be something that if you have someone that works in the medical profession and you start to hear from them, hey, just started clinical trials on this drug. I don't even know if they're allowed to say that, but if they are, then that might be a very positive sign. The positive sign that we're moving faster and closer in antibody treatments, as well as perhaps closer to a vaccine. If we see some type of coordinated effort to really scale up production of both the antibody treatments and the vaccines of remdesivir, if we start to see news about production capacities of drug companies being shipped overseas so that some of the drugs are being produced in other countries so that we could focus all of our manufacturing capacity on COVID-19 related drugs, that might be a very good sign. Another thing that we might be looking for is if there's some sort of coordinated effort, if we start to see some sort of commission being formed and it's kind of coordinating all the efforts around COVID-19 and it's sharing data back and forth, and we see the FDA is also working alongside to streamline the processes so these things aren't taking forever to get approved and we're not going through all these regulatory hurdles, that might also be a really good sign. And finally, the more widespread use we could see of people using PPEs, masks, the more we see testing happening on a wide scale, from a wide scale perspective. So we're looking for widespread use of PPEs, widespread testing occurring. So that's it for this week's episode, special edition of the Mobile Home Park Desktop. I hope you guys found it informative, and if you have any insights, if you're better versed in this than I am, and you want to share some things that maybe I got wrong or some things that you found out in your own research, please feel free to share and comment and let me know, and let everyone know that ends up watching this video. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.